As a young adult and a parent, what were your thoughts and feelings about the issues of the time?
Well, that's a big question. First of all, I was very excited about these issues, and very excited to be in a place where so many of these issues were being talked about and acted on in public life. I was very supportive of the anti-war movement because I myself was against the war, felt that it was wrong and that the government was moving in the wrong direction. And I was very much supportive of the civil rights movement. And maybe we'll talk more about this later, but the other movements that were related to the civil rights movements, movements for liberation of various kinds of people. So I was very pro-freedom and pro-free speech. So in that sense, I guess we would have been thought of as sort of radicals, my wife and I, your grandma and I, radicals of the age. We even marched in some of the parades and were part of the demonstrations. But I was very much against the violence that began to develop sometimes. I didn't think that massive breaking of laws and destroying property, which sometimes happened. People would break with store windows and they would do things like that. We weren't for that at all, and we opposed that, and we were very much against the growing of, developing of young people taking drugs, and drugs were very damaging, and this became a way of life. And so not all of the expressions of freedom and protests were things that we could approve of or embrace. But the main issues of civil rights and of the war and of the freedom to express ourselves and to dissent from the government's policies, we were very much in favor of that and actually did participate in them.
Can you talk about how the 1960s affected our use of language?
Well, a little bit. I know that there were new expressions. First of all, I think the use of language became much more free in public life, to say what you thought and not be too concerned about niceties and rudeness and so on. I don't know if some of this was good, some of it was bad, but freedom of speech was a very big movement in the 60s. There were new expressions that wouldn't seem new to you now, but I remember that something like groovy was a new expression. And far out was an expression that developed among the young people in the city in the 60s. And one word that's so common now that you wouldn't even think about it is the word like. That's used so common especially by younger people, but now, and not even younger people, older people now, more younger people then. Like is a word that's used in almost every sentence sometimes by people, and that was something that developed in the 60s. So there were new language illustrations that began to develop. I think, like I said, public speech changed, and it became more acceptable for people to use profanity and swear words in the public, and that wasn't always such a nice thing, but it was like you have to be free to express yourself. There were new words that were developed and words that were rejected, the names of different kinds of people. Maybe we'll talk more about this when we get into some of the other civil rights movements and so on. But the word Negro became rejected, and for black people, or for African, who we call now African American people, the word Oriental was rejected. For Asian people of different nationalities, Indian was a word for Native American, we call today, and that word was rejected. And the question of what South Americans and Latin Americans would be, Hispanic or Chicano, words like this. And in terms of women, the name women rather than girls became very important. because it used to be that even grown women often were referred to as girls, and so it was the words that were used to describe people, large groups of people, became changed in the course of the 60s. So I think there was a language change, like any new generation, there are new language, but these words would be related to the movements of the time, especially.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how the 1960s affected our music, art, and fashion?
Yeah, that's I could use some help on that. But I know that music, especially popular music, changed pretty radically in the 60s, though I think it was kind of rooted in the late 50s. But moving from rock and roll, which was really the late 50s, to the Beatles, which the Beatles came into popularity in the very early 60s, and of course they've lasted ever since. And from that to hard rock, having of rock concerts in public places. There were great rock concerts that began to take place. Sometimes they were related to demonstrations, or they turned into demonstrations, but music was affected in that way, I think. Popular music really had a 1960s sound to it. As far as painting goes, and art and painting, I'm not an artist, so I don't know a lot about art, but I do know that in the 60s art became sort of free for all as well, and you had a lot of public art, buildings and fences and art that would be painted to illustrate the movements that were taking place. In Berkeley, this was very common. It wasn't just graffiti. I guess it was graffiti, but it became more than that. It would be places where massive pictures would be painted of the movements that were going on in public places. So that would be some kind of art that would take place. Fashion, dressing, is really distinctive in the 60s and lasted on more into the 70s. And that was the breakdown of having to dress certain ways. I remember when I first came, I thought I was invited to a gathering, a party in the evening of young people, and I came in my jacket and tie, like I've been used to in Connecticut, and everyone was in jeans, usually torn at the knees, and old shirt, and I felt very much out of place, and I soon discovered that in the 60s out here in Berkeley, and in the 70s, but then spreading all over the country, dressing fashion was much more informal, and then it turned into kind of wild expressions with long, colorful clothes for both men and women. The pictures that we look at now back of what we looked like in the 60s and 70s are really kind of humorous sometimes. And men let their hair grow real long. Almost all men, young boys and men, wore longer hair then, some of them real long, but that was very different from the 50s when I grew up. So fashions did change, and basically it was a protest against the conformity of fashion that people had known before. They dressed however they wanted to.